Before we start, I just want to thank the Dare County Department of Health and Human Services, particularly Dr. Davies, who's still here, and also Drew Pearson from Emergency Management. They have been with us since we first had observations of petroleum at the Old Navy site in Buxton, which I'll talk about today, and have worked with us tirelessly on evaluating public health and other public hazards there, and we really appreciate the partnership. So with that, I'm going to just start with a little bit of history about this site, but before I do that, I want to tell you who is involved in this situation from the federal government. The first agency involved is the National Park Service. We own the land here, and as you'll find out in a few moments, we have owned this land all along, provided it to the United States military for use. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. The Army Corps of Engineers is involved. They restore DoD, which are Department of Defense sites that were used before 1986 under the Formerly Used Defense Site Program. You might have heard that comment this morning, FUDS. FUDS stands for Formerly Used Defense Site. Coast Guard Sector North Carolina is the agency that responds to pollution events. You might have heard some questions earlier about the Environmental Protection Agency. If there is a release of pollution in the United States of America, you're supposed to call a number, and that is for the National Response Center. If you're in an inland county in the United States, the EPA responds. If you're in a coastal county, the Coast Guard responds. Sector North Carolina is the group that works with us. They work on boat groundings and other hazardous substances in the coastal area, and they have been very involved in this situation. And finally, another agency that's involved is the Coast Guard's Civil Engineering Unit. They're in Cleveland. They manage Coast Guard infrastructure and the CERCLA process. CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act for non-petroleum contamination, which may be also present at this site. So let's talk a little bit about history here. Obviously, we're up here in Manio on Roanoke Island right now. The site we're going to talk about today is in Buxton. In 1953, the Secretary of Interior established Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Within a couple years of that establishment, we were already in the works with an agreement. Actually, it was what's called a special use permit with the Navy to develop Naval Station Cape Hatteras that was issued under a permit. This was for surveilling foreign activity off our coast. I can't confirm this, but all accounts seem to indicate that the first detection of a diesel-powered Soviet submarine occurred from this site, just a stone's throw from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. The station was used by the Navy until 1982, and as they were departing, the United States Coast Guard said, we would also like a facility in eastern North Carolina. This is a prime location for an administrative facility. They decided to adaptively reuse the large majority of buildings that the Navy had built at this site for the purposes of their operations. They used that with permission from the National Park Service under what's called an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding and a General Agreement. That occurred until about 2010. In the middle of the time that they were working there, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and did some work, and in 1998, they established this site as a formally used defense site for the purposes of remediating contamination from the Navy. And now we're going to talk about current conditions, 2023-24. Debris and strong odors of petroleum and occasional sheens from petroleum have been observed at this site. So this is an aerial. A lot of the photographs I'm going to show you today are from the beach right in front of it. If you've been down there, it's about a 50-acre site. All of the buildings have been removed. Some of the infrastructure in the ground apparently has not. So this was a very serious, large facility. This is a photograph looking towards the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse before it was moved in 1999. You can see just how close it was to that lighthouse. There were many, many buildings on this site. It's been reported that over 100 people came to work here every day. A lot of activity here. This is a view from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse looking north, and there's actually a building. It's to the right. There are two buildings that are closest to the ocean here. The one on the south side, closest to the lighthouse, was a club for officers to go. It was a recreation club or a nightclub, basically. And the building that is just to the north of there is a building called Building 19. We're going to be talking about that a lot as I go through this presentation. This is an aerial view of the area. By the way, this picture, which was from 1975, was during a time where the jetties were being repaired. You can actually see the middle jetty there. There are 3 jetties. You probably get a lot of questions about the jetties that are near the lighthouse there. They were installed by the United States Navy for the purposes of protecting this naval facility, starting in 1969 and finishing in the mid-70s. So what have we seen since September 1st? On September 1st, I got text messages and phone calls that this place smelled like petroleum, like diesel, and that there was debris all over the beach. This was a result of some large swells that came in from offshore from some hurricanes. Obviously, we did not have a direct impact from hurricanes, but anybody that lives here knows that you can have a hurricane or a tropical storm hundreds of miles off the shore, and the big, powerful, long period swells can directly impact the beaches. And that's what we started seeing. We started seeing all these steel pipes, concrete rubble, massive chunks of concrete and steel. Concrete blocks that appear to be the foundation of a wastewater tank. Septic drain field parts falling out of the dune onto the beach. Large amounts of peat soil, and this is important as well. This peat soil, this organic soil, is what you might find if you were to walk into the Sound from Highway 12 anywhere on Hatteras Island. As you get into that salt marsh, there's a lot of organic, muddy material in there. That oftentimes actually is exposed and eroded out onto the beach. That's because our areas that are currently Atlantic-facing beachfront used to be Sound front on Pamlico Sound thousands of years ago. So we started finding these chunks of soil that was clearly contaminated with petroleum, and the way that we know that is we had some of them tested and they smelled like diesel. We also started seeing the outline of a very large building. This is Building 19. It was also known as the Terminal Building. If you notice a large cable from this building that appears to be going into the water, that is a hydrophone cable. It's a cable that was used for listening for foreign activity off the coast. We don't know how far it went into the Atlantic Ocean. We know that some other sites actually had cables that went out more than 100 miles into the Atlantic Ocean. This is a thick steel cable about this big around, and it is still present. We had no idea it was here before September 1st and this fall. That is the footer that supported the foundation and the rest of the walls of the building. This is a very large building. You can actually see the cable coming out of that big chunk of concrete. This building is called a cable vault. As the name implies, this is where the cable came out of the building and went out into the ocean. We also started finding lots of pipes, including pipes that appeared to be pipes that were used for moving some form of petroleum, whether it was a fuel distribution system or pipes simply for heating oil or other types of oil that might have supplied boilers for these buildings. I'm going to show you this video right here just to give you an idea of what this site actually looks like. This video was taken last week, right before the public meeting that we held in Buxton. Give you a sense of things. We're just about 200 feet down from the southernmost house in the village of Buxton, and you're starting to see chunks of debris, which is from the old naval structures at the site. As we continue down, you see the northern portion of Building 19, or the terminal building. You see the first cable vault there, which is where one of the cables came out of. You also see lots of other debris, and you see a massive concrete pad there, which was actually the foundation for a large antenna. If you were to walk on the ground this day, it would have been much more dramatic than this, but this gives you a feel for the site. And I bring this up because Chairman Woodard mentioned earlier, Cape Hatteras Seashore is 75 miles long from South Nags Head to the tip of Ocracoke Island. It is our understanding, based on what we've seen, that this situation is only affecting a small area of land in front of the old military site. So on September 1st, we called the Coast Guard when we got reports from the public, and they took a sample, and the first sample came back as positive for petroleum hydrocarbons. They took another sample on September 8th, and that also came back as characteristic of light fuel oil and lubricating oil. The Army Corps of Engineers also came down. We'll talk about that in a moment. As I said before, this is a formerly used defense site that they established for the purposes of remediating petroleum contamination. This dark material you see on the beach here is not oil. It is peat soil. It's historic marsh soil or sediment. As a matter of fact, you can actually see old trees from thousands of years ago that were part of the marsh that are now exposed on the beach. You also see a cable and that cable vault. And they took a chunk of that soil right from that area. It came back at 36,000 milligrams per kilogram total petroleum hydrocarbons, diesel range organic. What does that mean? It means petroleum that's characteristic of the types of fuel that's out there, of the family of diesel fuels as opposed to gasoline, okay? If you're curious to know what 36,000 milligrams per kilograms means relative to the state's NCDEQ action level, it's 360 times higher. The action level is 100 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million in North Carolina. This is not surprising that we are seeing this. We have learned this since September 1st. What you're seeing here is the Army Corps of Engineers report from 2004. I believe it was finalized in 2005. All of those dashed marks on, or those dashed polygons here are areas where the Army removed petroleum contaminated sediment due to significant quantities of fuel or petroleum that spilled or leaked at this site when the Navy was here between 1956 and 1982. Today, that blue line represents about where the high tide or the mid-tide line goes to. There are existing Army Corps of Engineers groundwater monitoring wells here because the groundwater continues to have signs of contamination in it. The areas of contaminated soil that we have been finding are right over this area where petroleum contamination was historically removed. And by the way, this is the location of historic Building 19 and apparently the location where there was a fuel pipeline that went out into this area. For your information, by March of 2004, the Army Corps of Engineers removed 4,006 tons or 2,707 cubic yards of petroleum contaminated sediment. The report that we were able to find upon finding these odors of petroleum this fall indicates that not all petroleum contamination was removed due to the presence of roadways and other infrastructure based on what we read in this report. And to date, we are unaware that that petroleum contamination was removed. Why is this happening? You see a photograph here of this same site. By the way, look at that curve in the road and look at the distance from that curve to the water line. This is Building 19. And look at the area today. That's Building 19 now. Those are the foundation areas. They're hard to see with the waves here. And you can now see the distance between the curve in the road and the ocean. Areas that were contaminated before are now being exposed to the beachfront and to the ocean due to erosion. You can also see from this photograph a 1958 shoreline and 73 shoreline. And now the shoreline is back where that building is, Building 19. So, interestingly, the Army Corps of Engineers came into Building 19, where you saw that foundation and all that cable material in 1985, and implemented a building demolition project to remove it, including the foundations and utilities associated with the building. It appears today that not all of the materials were actually removed. And interestingly, a lot of the petroleum contamination that we're seeing is right in or to the south of that building. Again, these are locations that were known to be contaminated with petroleum. In February of 2001, we started getting more reports of sheen in the water. There were reports of surfers that may have come out of the water. They did not come into this area because, well, we hope they didn't. This area has been closed since the first day that odors were observed. They came out of the water saying that they smelled like petroleum, and our rangers agreed that it smelled like there was some type of oil on their wetsuits and perhaps in their hair. This is just downstream from this area. Our staff went out on February 1st and found an old pipe coming out of the beach in this exact same area. And we sampled that. We scraped material from outside of it, sent it to a licensed laboratory in North Carolina, and it came back positive for petroleum hydrocarbons. So what I'm letting you know is there appears to be unremediated petroleum-contaminated sediment that remains in this area, and there are also maybe some petroleum infrastructure that continues to have some contamination inside of it. We don't know if these are all of the sources. I'm just sharing with you what we know. Of all the samples that were taken by the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Park Service, whether they have been organic soil, sand soil samples, or groundwater temporary wells, or even a shovel pit test that the Corps did, they have all come back as positive for petroleum hydrocarbons. So it appears clear that this site continues to have petroleum contamination at it. This has generated a tremendous amount of concern, understandably, from me, my staff, the National Park Service, and the local community. These are just little things from social media of newspapers and others telling folks to avoid the area. This is very concerning. Dr. Beach, that's Dr. Stephen Leatherman from Florida International University, I believe, has ranked this one of the best beaches in the United States. And there's been a lot of negative media attention about this. This is a photograph of this site just from last week, from a couple days before we had the public meeting, showing all that naval infrastructure. In addition to the Army Corps of Engineers' work to remediate the Navy's contamination at this site, I mentioned that the United States Coast Guard utilized the site from 1984 to 2010. When they left, they took some soil samples indicating that there may be some other non-petroleum contaminants at the site. Since they left in 2010, we have been requesting that they perform a more detailed Phase 2 environmental study to delineate the extent and magnitude of those non-petroleum contaminants, and they have come through on that. Last summer, they began a study. All of these sites here, all these blue dots, are actually core sampling sites where they have taken deep core samples, and they are analyzing those samples for other contaminants, and they've told us they expect a report back in June. Again, I want to thank Dare County Department of Health and Human Services. They helped us now twice issue a precautionary public health advisory warning the public to stay out of the water in this area. We have continued to keep the site closed, and we have an informational webpage at go.nps.gov/Buxton Beach. You're probably wondering, so what? What is everybody doing about this? We are continuing to have weekly meetings with the Army Corps of Engineers, urging them to collect as much information as they need to collect to begin some form of remediation at the site. We have also had almost daily communications with the Coast Guard since this has happened, and they come down every time we report observations of petroleum. Senior leaders from the Coast Guard, the National Park Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers have also been meeting every 2 weeks. I am not aware of a plan as of today to remediate this problem. All I can tell you is I'm continuing to work hard on advocating for that, and I will be sure to provide you with updates of anything that I hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate you sharing that info with us like you did from last week. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Any questions, Chairman Woodard?
Any questions for Dave at this point?
Really thorough.
Very good.
Very thorough.
All right.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.